I'd start with my own story because I came to Neurofeedback first as a client. So my story actually begins with a community room event at Natur-Tyme in November 2005. They had a biofeedback day over in the Bridge Street store. And I had just read this book, Healing Anxiety and Depression by Dr. Daniel Amen. I had been struggling at that point for 2.5 years with anxiety, depression, sensory processing challenges, cognitive problems, just sensory overload. I was just overwhelmed, confused, depressed. And I had gone to my doctor. I'd gone on thyroid medication, and that didn't solve it. I gave in and went on SSRI medications. And before I did that, I tried things like St. John's wort or SAMI, supplements first. But then I gave in and went on the Zoloft, and picked me up out of depression and put me into this anxious, racing thought condition. So then they put me on mood stabilizer meds and gave me bipolar diagnosis. And those meds, one of them helped initially, but then didn't help in the long run. So I didn't know what to do. And so Dr. Daniel Amen's book was very helpful to me because in here he divides anxiety and depression into 7 different types based on symptom clusters. And while I'd already been given a bipolar diagnosis, I didn't really quite, I was on the edge of whether I fit into that category via his book, but I fit really clearly into his 7th category of anxiety and depression, which he calls unfocused anxiety and depression. And that, he said, could be caused by toxic exposure, nutritional deficiency, some kind of unidentified chronic infection, and it really fit me better than the bipolar diagnosis, so I thought there was some truth to that. But it was in his book that I first heard the word neurofeedback. I'd never heard of neurofeedback before 2005. But Dr. Daniel Amen, when he was a psychiatrist in the military, he had used neurofeedback to help military personnel. And that got him really interested in how the brain functions. And he's gone on now to become the world's foremost authority at looking at mental health problems through SPECT brain scans. So after reading this book, I was trying to decide, well, should I have a SPECT brain scan to see what's going on in my brain? Or should I see if there's any neurofeedback providers around? And that's when I got the flyer about the biofeedback day at Natur-Tyme. So I came up to Natur-Tyme. Might have been I live in Cortland County, so it may have been the first time I ever came to Natur-Tyme. And I met a neurofeedback provider there, Barry Bates, who ran Syracuse Neurofeedback. And he gave me a symptom inventory to fill out. And when I filled it out, he looked at it and said, "Anybody ever told you you have bipolar disorder?" So just by looking at my symptoms, he put me in that category. I went to my first neurofeedback session a month or so later, and I got a profound relaxation of my nervous system. And I took a walk after I got home, and I had what's called the clear windshield effect, where everything was bright and crystal clear, and my mood was just as bright and crystal clear as everything I was seeing, and it was, wow, it was powerful. So I continued with neurofeedback training, and I can remember one of the very first sessions, my cheeks relaxed so profoundly in the session that I had to reach up and touch them because it felt like they were sagging. I had to see if they were sagging. I hadn't known I carried any tension in my cheeks. I hadn't known that you could be as profoundly relaxed as neurofeedback was able to, neurofeedback was able to show my nervous system where to go to be relaxed and comfortable. So I got very, very intrigued. And came for ongoing training. This is a quote of Dr. Daniel Amen. "Brain dysfunction is the #1 reason people fail at work, at school, and in relationships. When the brain is ineffective, so are we. The brain is a supercomputer that runs your life." And as I continued to explore what was going on with my brain, I did have an MRI in my brain, and it showed that there were numerous lesions throughout the white matter of my brain. And it was a pattern that was associated with toxic mold exposure. So there was a toxin that was dysregulating me. Toxic mold. Yeah. Is the sound loud enough for you guys? Okay. Yeah, so I got treated for toxic mold illness. But, in that process, all this brain damage was documented. And I'd become a neurofeedback client a little bit before I figured out the toxic mold illness part. But once I got treated for toxic mold illness and got the toxin out of my system, the neurofeedback became far more effective for me than it had been. I was getting short-term gains from neurofeedback before that, but once I got the toxin out of my system, I was able to make long-term gains that helped. Yes. Go ahead. I had 2 exposures to toxic mold. My profession at that time was as a agricultural fence contractor. I was working with my then husband. We were running agricultural fence construction business. And in 2002, we switched suppliers with fence posts. And they were $1 a post cheaper, helped us be competitive on the marketplace, helped us be able to afford to raise our family of 6. But there was this black dusty stuff on these new posts. And we pound the post with a hydraulic post pounder, cloud or dust comes off, we're breathing it in. And I began to be chronically ill a couple of months after we switched fence post suppliers. And then I recovered over the winter when I wasn't building fence, and it came back the spring of 2003 when I returned to building fence. But it wasn't until 2006 that I began to learn about the connection between toxic mold illness and multiple chemical sensitivity. I had extreme chemical sensitivities. I was getting to the point where I had to wear a respirator to enter stores, even to enter something like Natur-Tyme, because exposure to brand new products would destabilize my brain, and then I wouldn't have the driving skills to be able to drive home. But if I wore a respirator in stores, I could maintain my brain function well enough to be able to drive home. So we'd formed, I and a couple of neighbors formed a multiple chemical sensitivity support group. And a woman came up from the Catskills for our support group. And she's the one that told me about the connection between toxic mold exposure and multiple chemical sensitivity. She told me about the doctor she'd worked with, Dr. Shoemaker in Maryland, who is the world's foremost authority on toxic mold illness. So I went down to Maryland and worked with him. He's the one that did the MRI of my brain and showed all those lesions. So while he could treat me for the mold illness, he didn't have a way to heal the brain. He knew these lesions could heal, but he didn't have specific. Yes, he's a doctor, a family practitioner who just happened to discover this branch of medicine, biotoxin-based illnesses. So I had extreme chemical sensitivities and toxic mold illness, and I was very depressed, confused, overwhelmed. But once I got treated for mold illness and returned to neurofeedback as a client, then I was able to make long-term gains. Yes? I was still. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not a typical neurofeedback client. A typical client today comes for 20 to 40 sessions, and typically their problems get solved within that time frame. More severe conditions like autism would require more real severe brain injury. But there were so many layers to my case. There was a genetic vulnerability to bipolar disorder. The majority of my aunts and uncles on my father's side have it. So there was that genetic vulnerability. There was the toxic mold exposure that caused all these lesions. And another aspect of my illness I didn't understand at the beginning, but that neurofeedback eventually showed me, is there's 2 kinds of neurofeedback that we do at Syracuse Neurofeedback. One is called awake state training, which works with the cortex of the brain. And we train that to help people become calm, stable, and optimize performance. But then there's a second type of training we can bring in, which is for trauma resolution, and it's for addictions, learned habits. And that's called deep state training. And in deep state training, we guide the brain to the place in between awake and asleep, and we hover it right there. And the first part of the brain to go to sleep is the amygdala. So the amygdala's offline. And that allows the subconscious mind to present to the conscious mind those traumatic experiences in our life that had such emotional intensity tied to them that the logical, rational part of the brain hadn't known how to cope. And so it shoved them down the subconscious, and they're down there, like in the basement, in the foundation, causing ongoing stress to the whole system. So, certainly I was a person where we needed to focus first on getting me calm and stable. But after I was calmer and more stable, we introduced deep state training. And the deep state training for me brought up some repressed memories of severe childhood abuse I hadn't known had occurred. My parents hadn't known it had occurred. And it was pretty severe and at a fairly young age. And so it also became really obvious that maybe perhaps my biggest problem of all was PTSD, which hadn't been diagnosed yet. And it was about the time that the deep state training brought up those repressed memories, and I discovered that there was a part of me alive inside of me that I didn't even know was there, which was really needy and had all these emotions as though these events had just happened when it had been 40-some years ago. And that I got really, really, really intrigued by neurofeedback at that point, and I asked my practitioner, will you become my mentor? I want to be your apprentice. I want to learn everything you know. And so he first let me sit in on one new client. When that went well, he invited me to sit in on all his clients. So I was his intern for 18 months, and then I became his coworker, and we worked side by side for about 8 years. And then he moved out of state a couple years ago, and I took over ownership of the practice. So I arrived at in the practice in January 2006 as a severely dysregulated client with tremendous number of issues, with all these layers to my problem. And over time, neurofeedback peeled away those layers, and I worked them through. And I went from a woman who had become too disabled to work to a woman who was able to learn a whole new career. And so I've dedicated my life to it ever since. This slide just points out how common the types of problems I had are in women today. 1 out of every 4 women are taking antidepressant medications. And that's the other question I didn't answer, was my medications. I was on Lamictal at the time I started neurofeedback. It was a couple years later before I very slowly and very gradually weaned myself off. But I have been off medications for at least 5 years now. Antidepressant use among women has risen 29% since 2001. Women are 2.5 times more likely to be taking antidepressant medication than men. Antidepressant medications, as prescribed, have been shown to be no more effective than placebo. Potentially they could be more effective, but as they are currently prescribed, their studies show that really not. Psychiatric medications may worsen the long-term course of psychiatric disorders. Going on medication does not necessarily increase and may perhaps decrease your chance of recovery. And sometimes antidepressants increase the risk of a switch into mania and thus bipolar illness. And that might have happened in my case. Mm-hmm. Yes. No, but I just think that it has to, like, those rural consumer, it has to come. Can you just talk on that one like on the side? Okay, yeah. Profound. Honestly, I'm sorry. I agree that I don't think our schools are designed to meet the needs of our young children. Their need is to move, to learn through play, to socialize, and so I certainly think school environments are part of the problem. And mold toxicity is not uncommon in schools. They have flat roofs. flat roofs are vulnerable to leaking. So some schools are moldy. One of my friends was a social worker here in Syracuse, and she got extraordinarily ill from the office in high school here in Syracuse. And the district did not want to listen to the fact that, that was a moldy space. So toxic mold illness, I think, is it's an epidemic that's unrecognized by mainstream healthcare. And brain fog is huge in toxic mold illness. Yeah, it's a big factor, big symptom, the symptom that gets expressed in toxic mold illness. That and racing thoughts and fatigue. You're talking about the weight gain from antidepressants. I've seen some recent research, and some of the antidepressants actually have an antibiotic effect, so that they are affecting what kind of microbes live in our GI tract, and favoring those that promote obesity and harming those that promote being thin. So that's how some of those are functioning in terms of creating obesity. Toxic mold illness can also create obesity, overweight problems, because it affects the leptin receptor. And adverse childhood events are a huge factor. Childhood trauma is a strong predictor of adult illness. Having 6 or more adverse events in your childhood occur shortens a person's lifespan by 20 years. This impact holds true even when one does not smoke, drink, use drugs, and maintains a healthy weight. For those individuals, a adverse childhood event score of 7 results in a 360% increase in heart disease. So, adverse childhood events. There's been a bunch of studies in the past decade looking at the effect of adverse events in childhood on adult health, as well as childhood health. And they found it's far bigger factor than we ever recognized before. And that turned out to be a huge factor for me. So why is the impact of childhood trauma so profound? And so, why does it last throughout your life? Childhood trauma sets in place a harmful brain-body stress cycle, which impacts one's health and well-being throughout one's life. Neural structures are affected by emotional and physical trauma. Negative feedback loops form in the brain. Epigenetic switches are triggered in ways that cause ongoing dysregulation of the brain's ability to moderate stress. Stress is the major contributor to the development of disease. And you mentioned the rising rate of disabilities, particularly in boys. 1 in 6 children in this country now has a developmental disability. It is a huge epidemic, and of course, the one that has skyrocketed more than any other is autism. Back in 1970, 1 out of every 10,000 kids had autism. 2014, it was 1 in 68. The most recent evidence is it's either 45 or 48. Something like 1 in 48 now. If it continues at this rate, I think it's like 16 years from now, and 50% of kids, the majority of boys, will have autism if we don't turn this around. And that will have tremendous impacts on the health of our culture. I've been following recently the work of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is getting into this issue of how are mercury and other toxins contributing to the development of these neurodevelopmental disorders. And he says if you look at the statistics, something happened in 1989 that made the rates of developmental disability in males skyrocket. He wonders if it's a number of new vaccinations came on board around that time, and sometimes they have contaminants and toxins in them, as well as they're challenging the immune system. I don't know what the causes are. There's so many other things, so many other toxins, changes in how we're growing our food. I don't know what's causing it, but it's huge. So, anxiety, depression, PTSD, insomnia, ADD, ADHD, they're signs of brain dysfunction. And medications are designed to reduce symptoms, but they do not resolve the underlying cause of these life-altering conditions. The brain's an amazing organ. It's more vulnerable to injury than we ever understood before. But the good news is it's far more capable of rewiring itself than we believed in the past. So I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Concussion that talks about brain injury in football players. But they're finding it's it's huge. It's a huge cause of early dementia, brain injury. A lot more people are walking around with mild brain injuries manifesting as mental health problems, and they have no clue that it's from when they went over the handlebars of their bicycle a decade ago or whatever happened to them. But it's common. One of the things that neurofeedback takes advantage of is that the principal activity of the brain is to make changes in itself. We can harness that. Neuroplasticity is a fancy word that people have been talking about in the past decade, and it means that it refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. So neurofeedback is an exercise of the brain that harnesses that potential. Neurofeedback shows the brain its own activity, providing feedback that enables self-regulation. The brain learns to regulate itself, changing its activity patterns and structure in response to information about its own behavior. We give the brain opportunities to learn how to downregulate the stress response. We train the brain to optimize sleep, mood, attention, behavior, and performance. So how do we do that? Here's a picture of a neurofeedback session. So we put sensors on the head. These are just little tiny, sensors smaller than a dime. We paste 4 of them on the head with the waxy paste. And they're like stethoscopes for the brain. They're listening in to what the brain's doing. They're not inputting anything. The sensors are simply monitoring. And the information, the brainwave pattern information that the sensors pick up, this here is a neuroamp, and it amplifies the brainwave signal and sends it over to the clinician's computer screen. So the clinician sees a ongoing display of brainwave activity. And in front of the client is a TV screen or large monitor that has on it an entertaining form of feedback that reflects back to the client information about its brainwave activity. So in this case, this client's watching the feedback called Inner Tube. It's a spaceship game, spaceship flying through a colorful tube. How fast the spaceship goes is in response to the ebb and flow of the client's brainwaves. And it's a subconscious process, so the client can't figure out consciously how to make that spaceship go fast all the time. Sometimes it'll go fast, and sometimes it'll go slow. But the subconscious part of the brain recognizes the correlations between its own activity and the speed of that spaceship. And by getting the opportunity to witness itself, it can figure out how to regulate itself more effectively. So we send a couple different messages, the ebb and flow of the brain waves around the speed of the spaceship in this program. And then the other is we're sending in inhibitory messages. The software is monitoring all the brain waves from 0 to 40 hertz. If there's, in looking at different sets of brain waves, different bandwidths, and if there's a sudden surge of amplitude in one brain wave that goes outside the bounds of that brain's normal activity, the software will send in a black fog that will roll down the tunnel. And if that activity subsides, that cloud will roll back. If that activity keeps amplifying, the whole screen will go black. So that's our inhibitory message. It's just a subtle, most of the times it's just a little, oops, don't do that kind of message. Just very gentle, pointing out to the brain, ooh, that activity was outside your normal limits. Control your activity a little more tightly. Don't go to these extreme ends. So I symptom track any client who wants to be symptom tracked. So this is the software generates graphs of how the client's symptoms change over time. In this woman, we were tracking difficulty completing tasks, poor sustained attention, difficulty organizing personal time and space, poor body awareness, addictive behaviors, lack of appetite awareness, aggressive behavior, hyperactivity, emotional reactivity, agitation, impatience, anxiety, depression, fears, fatigue, chronic constipation, reflux, difficulty working, effort fatigue, stomach aches, chronic pain. And she rated those symptoms on a 0 to 10 scale, with 0 being none, 10 being this is a real big challenge. And this is how the severities changed over time, over 18 sessions done over 2 months. She has gone on to be a neurofeedback professional herself. She's a mental health provider. So for that woman and for myself, these are some of the round responses we got. Our racing thoughts quieted down. Mind and body relaxed. Energy increases. Mood lifts. Sleep and behavior improve. Chronic pain lessens. This is a 17-year-old I worked with many years ago. He had a bipolar diagnosis. His mom was a school teacher. Her son was often out of control. So out of control, they had to call the police often to them for help. And he had been hospitalized for psychiatric illness a couple weeks before he came to me. And this is the graph of how he improved over 45 sessions. And I sat down with his mom. We usually do a review of the progress made at session 20. And when I sat down with his mom at session 20, she said to me, neurofeedback has given me back hope for my son's future. And she as a mom was getting a lot of, judgment and blame for, why is your son so out of control? And she'd done everything she could. It was a situation that was beyond her ability to control, and so it was a real relief to her own stress for her son to improve the way he did. For at least the first month, I like clients to come twice a week, and the ideal frequency of sessions is often enough to keep the symptom improvement in place. So if someone finds that they get significant symptom improvement from a session, but 3 days after it starts to creep back in, well, it would be ideal to come every other day, until that symptom relief lasted longer. But for clients who find that their symptom relief lasts a whole week, it's fine to come once a week. But at the beginning, I usually have people come twice a week, and then at some point, there's some week where they miss a session for some reason, and if their symptoms didn't spike over a course of 7 days, then they can go down to once a week. Okay, at the beginning, this 17-year-old had no ability to, no self-awareness. He could not do the symptom tracking himself because he wasn't clued in to his own behavior and challenges. But this mom transitioned the symptom tracking over to her son as he gained the ability to perceive his own challenges, and so he took over the symptom tracking at a certain point. And this one huge bump here was I tried changing the protocol, and it was a negative effect, and we went right back to what we've been doing before. So. From age 1 to 82. And this can be done with a baby sitting on mom's lap. It is possible. It isn't done that often, but it can be. And it could be done with a 100-year-old. So neurofeedback improves impulse control. It calms the nervous system, enhances attention and performance, resulting in less behavior problems and interventions, less disruptions and stress, improved learning, Reduce needs for other supportive services. Improve success in adoptions and therapies. I am working with some of the foster kids from Hillside Children's Center, and Elmcrest Children's Center is now talking about bringing neurofeedback to their campus. Increase school performance and graduation. Reduce juvenile delinquency and crime. Addiction prevention and recovery. The cost per client typically ranges from $2,500 to $4,500, depending how many sessions they need. And that can't really be predicted in advance. I mean, I know someone with bipolar disorder is more apt to be on the upper end, and someone with a mild anxiety that they haven't had very long is more apt to be on the lower end, but each person's an individual. This is a 6-year-old boy I worked with in the past year. He had been stuck in anger and rage for 3 years, and he'd received 2 years of psychotherapy that had not helped his symptoms at all. He got a 90% reduction in symptom severity in 10 neurofeedback sessions over 3 months. So that's this original. They find they need to come back every 3 or 4 weeks for a booster session. I think if they'd done more intensive neurofeedback to start with, they might not need these booster sessions. They're just now getting up to like session 20. They'd done it. They were, having some financial challenges, so they kind of came the minimum they needed to at the start. But put them in a situation where they have to do booster sessions. I think if we'd done more focused training at the beginning, we might have been able to stop and not need booster sessions. So neurofeedback enhances school performance, it resolves behavior problems, increases attention and capability. It's a medication-free alternative. This is a boy, age 8, I worked with a few years ago. He had ADHD and auditory processing issues, and this is symptom tracking over 20 sessions. The upswing there is when he returned to school in the fall. So school was a stress, and there was a mild upswing when he returned to school, but nothing like what it had been the previous school year. In 2012, PracticeWise, which is the company that maintains the American Academy of Pediatrics evidence-based child and adolescent psychosocial interventions, they announced they were elevating biofeedback to a level 1 best support as intervention for attention and hyperactivity disorders. It's their job to tell the American Academy of Pediatrics what kind of therapies have the greatest amount of evidence behind them. And this became controversial. It didn't go too far after it came out because the pharmaceutical companies have a lot of political power. So the field of pediatrics is starting to recognize that the advantages of neurofeedback training, how much advantage there is compared to medications for ADHD. 2014 article highlighting a recent study points out recent studies have demonstrated limitations in medication in the long term. I mean, the medication only works while you're taking it for ADHD. As soon as the dose runs out, the effect runs out. It does not solve the problem. So there's a need for treatments that have more sustained effects, such as neurofeedback. And usually with ADHD, we find that it's kind of like a certain area of the brain, certain areas of the brain didn't mature or develop good enough regulation. We can train those areas. The problem seems resolved at a root cause level, and unless you get a head injury or something, it typically does not return. For individuals with developmental disabilities, we often see significant developmental gains in areas such as self-control, social and educational skills, IQ, sensory processing, speech, and coordination. The response to neurofeedback training is often quick and profound. With adequate reinforcement, the effects can last a lifetime. This is very similar to one I put up before. So it does have broad application. I've helped people with movement disorders. Some of the research has shown that people getting neurofeedback, especially children, they get a 10 to 30 point IQ gain, often from a series of sessions. Very helpful with post-concussion, asthma, allergies, immune function improve. We can impact a wide range of sleep challenges from insomnia, nightmares, bedwetting. Handwriting often improves. Anxiety, depression, trauma recovery, sensory processing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that's one of the advantages. A lot of males don't want to talk about it. And though they don't want to go to see a psychotherapist because talking just isn't their way. With neurofeedback, I need a brief report, are symptoms better or worse, in what way, but you don't need to dig into the roots of it, just, what's getting better, what hasn't gotten better yet. And they can sit and they can actually watch their favorite movie. I can incorporate feedback into a DVD. They'll be watching their favorite movie. Around the edge of the picture will be a black border that shrinks and grows to reflect their brainwave activity to them, and the picture fogs in and out for the inhibit message. And they're holding a teddy bear that vibrates more or less to reflect the ebb and flow of their brainwaves. So I think that's one of the advantages of neurofeedback is that other than a brief symptom report, you don't have to talk about it. For those who, other people have a tremendous need to talk, and psychotherapy can be very helpful. But I know for myself, I started psychotherapy a couple months before I started neurofeedback, and I was just going in circles, often leaving the session more agitated than I'd arrived. But once neurofeedback was calming my system, then I could make effective use of psychotherapy. So they blend beautifully. So how can neurofeedback be successful with such a wide range of conditions? The brain is the central control mechanism of the nervous system. Impacts the function of the brain and can impact everything from sensory processing to behavioral, emotional control, sleep, movement, pain perception, learning. Many of our clients are able to avoid, reduce, or eliminate medications. So a lot of parents do bring their kids with ADHD to us because they're getting pressure to put their kids on meds and they're looking for an option. So most of the rest of my slides are taken from Sue Offmer's protocol guide. There are different approaches to neurofeedback, and I use the Offmer method. And Sue's protocol guide is, very, very helpful tool. So the goals of neurofeedback are physiological self-regulation, psychological resolution, reduce symptoms, improve function, increased well-being and quality of life. Our nervous systems strive to keep us alive and functioning optimally, but we often get stuck in dysfunctional modes of behavior. Our goal is to allow the nervous system to calm down and reset itself onto a better path. So this is one of the models we really focus on in neurofeedback. All of us, throughout the course of the day, we go through different levels of arousal. If we get in a car accident, something really stressful happens, all of us are vulnerable to going over to emergency mode. Hopefully most of us spend most of the day in the center here, not over-aroused, not under-aroused, awake and efficient in carrying out our daily tasks. But some people, especially those who experienced early childhood trauma, are stuck over here in high arousal. So for the people that are stuck over here, just a little bit of stress will push people this way. And a little bit of stress can push them to overwhelmed where they just need to shut down very quickly because they're already stuck over here. And other people are stuck in under arousal. So these are the people that can't get going until they get that cup of coffee in the morning. They need that stimulant because it helps wake them up. And it will, their performance will rise as a result of drinking the coffee because it will push them this way into higher performance. But give the coffee to someone with a trauma background and they, it may make them so agitated they can't function. PTSD. Certainly one word for it. So from a neurofeedback perspective, we see brain dysregulation falling under three categories. The left side of the brain, the logical, rational side, when it becomes dysregulated, it fails to under-aroused condition. It's not quite awake enough. So you have problems like brain fog, inattention. And if you get depressed, it's more of a hopeless, helpless depression, where you have a it's all my fault kind of feeling. The right side of the brain, the emotional side, when it becomes dysregulated, it fails to over-aroused condition. It gets all turned up. And for one person, that might be anger and rage. For another, it might be high blood pressure and constipation and tension in their neck and shoulders. For someone else, it might be a fear-based anxiety. So they can be expressed different ways, but those are all right side over-arousal. And then the third way the brain can become dysregulated is called unstable arousal, where there's erratic shifts in arousal level. And it's almost like the right and the left side of the brain may be competing for who's in charge. And sometimes one side's winning out, sometimes the other, and you're swinging back and forth between right side overarousal symptoms and left side underarousal symptoms. So, bipolar disorder falls in that category. Autoimmune conditions, migraines, seizures, panic attacks, all fall in unstable arousal. Good self-regulation means both flexibility and stability of state. High arousal is useful in emergencies, but getting stuck there can lead to significant problems. In emergency mode, we hyper-focus on the emergency and ignore our bodies and our future plans. Low arousal states are essential for rest and sleep, but can interfere with good alert functioning during the day. Our goal with neurofeedback is to improve flexibility and stability of state regulation. And this just points more to the shifting of the arousal level. So with the neurofeedback, we are reflecting the ebb and flow of a certain brainwave back to the person. And with the Optima method, what we do at the beginning is figure out which brainwave we can reflect back, the activity of, back to that client that will guide them to the place where they feel profound relaxation, just profoundly relaxed, calm, alert, blissful. So the first session, I pick a ballpark of where I need to start this client. If they're highly aroused, I'll pick a pretty low frequency, and I'll keep going down if they continue to get more relaxed until I find that place that really is optimal for them. Mm-hmm.
So how is how do you determine
Yeah, by questions. So I ask about childhood trauma history. If they have a childhood trauma history, I'm more apt to start lower down. Often, they may not. So I'm also going by symptoms. How anxious are they? How long had they been that anxious? So if I think there's a lot of under-arousal symptoms as well as over-arousal symptoms, I'll start up higher. If I think there's a lot of over-arousal symptoms, I'll start lower. If it's someone with anger, rage, aggression, I'll start really low. Because I want to make sure I calm that person. So if I'm working with a foster child who's aggressive, we start at a very, very low frequency. Mm-hmm.
When you think about it, I understand that in the brain, let's say there's sort of like a brain wave. There's like normal function on the left-hand side, low arousal, like, your body wants to rest, you're sleep, the next one is the brain. On the high arousal, it's emergency. But what would bring someone to the question, like, what is the human, like, as human beings, like, what do we accomplish by being aggressive and high, like, we're fighting, like you said, that's the flight, the fight or flight?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of probably being stuck in fight or flight combined with poor impulse control. So impulse control is up here in the prefrontal lobe of the brain. And this area of the brain is very vulnerable to injury. And so from both toxins and bumps to the head. And so if there's impaired impulse control and someone's really over-aroused, stuck in emergency mode, then they're very apt to have more of a fight response. So by adjusting the reward frequency, we can shift their set point on this curve and try to get them so their set point is in the middle range where they're most comfortable. And these are the kind of indicators we use for whether we need to go up or down in frequency. You know, so if I do a session with a client and they come back next time and they tell me they could hardly get out of bed in the morning, they were just dragging, so then I'll raise their frequency to get a better response. Or if my client is still very fearful and anxious and agitated, I'll keep going down a frequency until I give them more relief. You know, things like constipation are very good to track. That's a very good indicator of whether the person's still over-aroused. If they're still having constipation, I probably still need to take them to a lower yet frequency. So neurofeedback protocols in the OFFER method are individualized and symptom-based, and we adjust them based on the client's response. So we keep track of sleep, behavior, mood, performance, attention. All are indicators of the client's arousal level, emotional state, and ability to self-regulate, and we adjust to optimize the outcome. So, you know, the key is finding the optimal reward frequency for that individual, choosing which site in the brain to train. So we know the OFFER method focuses on what does that client's symptoms tell us about which areas of the brain are likely dysregulated. So if the child is really hyper, can't sit still, then we start with a pathway here, tying the right temporal and parietal lobe together. It's a pathway for physical and emotional calming, also helps sensory processing. You know, and if they're having impulse control problems, then we'll make sure to bring in the prefrontal lobe too. So there's lots, you know, and specific cognitive problems can be addressed with specific sites. If we have a kid with autism who isn't speaking, there's a specific site we can bring in to help bring on speech. It's amazing what we can do. So we very carefully study and understand how the brain functions. The right hemisphere is about novelty and flexibility, environmentally motivated behavior, bottom-up control, sensing danger, creativity, early development. So if something went wrong in early development, I'm working with a child who was maybe adopted, and you know, I'll know I need to start on the right side. It's the right hemisphere's job to keep us alive and safe. It allows us to feel safe and comfortable in ourselves so that we can be open to others. It plays a huge role in developmental trauma. If someone has a developmental trauma background, I will start with right hemisphere training to help them learn self-regulation, to help overcome the chronic dysregulation that trauma has caused, and help them feel safe in their own bodies. So I mentioned before the parietal lobe for body relaxation awareness, spatial awareness, sensory integration. Temporal lobe helps with emotional regulation, physiological regulation, auditory processing, object and pattern recognition. So it can be helpful with reading as well. So this is at site T4P4. If a new client has developmental trauma or a chronic disorder or lack of resilience, the priority is calming them. I start with this site. Whereas if they had mood swings, seizures, panic, disassociation, asthma, migraines, autoimmune conditions, then I do that pathway T3, T4. And if they have both, I train both the first session. This is the prefrontal area that I was talking about for the impulse control, planning, organization, obsessive and compulsive symptoms, disinhibition, fear and attachment, emotional control. It's a key area. And the left hemisphere regulates conscious planning and executing of goal-directed behavior. Left prefrontal training impacts control, thinking, and acting. And this goes over the 4 quadrants of the brain that we train and why we train each area. Any questions you want to add at this point? These are the most basic placements that we train. So we use symptoms to guide our understanding of how the nervous system is dysregulated. Then the categories of dysregulation give us ideas on how to craft an effective neurofeedback program for each individual. So if I have someone with anxiety, I'm probably, if they have physical tension, I'm going to start with the right back quadrant of the brain, able to increase body awareness. If they have panic attacks, I'm going to start with inner hemispheric training to help the two hemispheres coordinate with behavior. And I'll bring in the right front if they're behavioral and emotionally based behavioral issues. It'll help with emotional reactivity, fear and anger, hypervigilance, paranoia, attachment problems. I'll bring in the left front for mental calming, obsessive worry, compulsive behavior, if there's any attention issues. And I can impact a lot of physical and behavioral symptoms. Right back training helps with balance and coordination, muscle tension and spasticity, hyperactivity, tremors, Parkinson's symptoms, constipation, bruxism, grinding of the teeth, the gritting of the teeth at night. The right front will help with aggressive and controlling behavior, oppositional behavior, thrill-seeking, emotional reactivity, road rage, self-injurious behavior. The left front will help with the impulse control, the motor and vocal tics. And inner hemispheric training with erratic shifts in mood or energy level. And the left back will help with learned skills and movements. So like if someone's had a brain injury and they've lost some of their former skills, they may very well regain them if we train that area. Grinding or gritting your teeth or clenching your jaw, typically often at night. These are how those areas are applied to people with developmental disorders. And these are some of the minor sites that we bring in for more specific problems. So there's site T4F8 that we use for acquisition of language. We have had success sometimes in the past bringing on speech in children with autism who have never spoken before. It's also a site that helps emotional expression, and it can help peak performance in music. T4, T6 is another site we use a lot with children with autism. And it helps the ability to read facial expression and body language of others. I was working with a college student with Asperger's, and on his 7th session I brought in that site T4, T6. And he was watching the movie Blind Side for his feedback, so the feedback was incorporated into that movie. And Sandra Bullock was on the screen. And I put the sensors on this new site, T4, T6, and within 2 minutes, he turned to me and he said, "That's funny. My eyes are following the faces of the character on the screen. Is that normal?" he asked me. He didn't know it was normal when you watch a movie and there's someone like Sandra Bullock on the screen for your eyes to be drawn to the person. And that site, within 2 minutes, he was able to observe and report that change. T402 is sometimes used with for emotional calming. For those with trauma or developmental disorders, it can be very soothing. The occipital placements way back here are also helpful with visual deficits related to traumatic brain injury or premature birth. On the left side, T3F7 can be helpful for word finding right here. So often use that with older people that are having a hard time coming up with the right words, or people who've been through chemo, who found problems with word recall sense, have responded well to that site. It can also help people who have articulation problems. T3, T5 back here can be helpful with coding words when reading. T3F3 can have a strong antidepressant effect. It's energizing, and uplifting, and motivating. So the long-term effects of neurofeedback is a learned ability to shift the state of the nervous system. Learning how to shift back into a calm, comfortable state. And a learned ability to maintain that state. Increase stability and flexibility of state. Enhance self-regulation. Better function from the brain you have. The exercise of shifting state repeatedly over a number of sessions leads to improved flexibility and stability of state, we're working toward improved self-regulation of brain function. A calmer and more stable brain is then capable of better function. So, in my case, neurofeedback transformed me from a woman who had become too disabled to work, who was overwhelmed by sensory issues, cognitive problems, emotions, and life circumstances, to a woman who was able to learn a whole new career. My career as a neurofeedback coach is the gift that grew out of my journey through mental illness. It was my own desperate search for answers that led me here to the forefront of neuroscience, and I'd love to share the transformative power of neurofeedback. So I do offer free initial neurofeedback sessions, and I do think that most people have never heard of neurofeedback. They may not know anybody who's ever done it. So I offer the free first session without charge so people can experience it. I include 30 minutes of neurofeedback training in that first session. And most people see clear positive gain right from that first session. And sleep is the symptom that responds most quickly to neurofeedback, so most people sleep better right after that first session. Anxiety is also pretty quick to begin to improve. Some things take longer, but particularly sleep and anxiety begin to improve pretty quickly. Headaches is another thing we work with. Neurofeedback is very effective for migraines and other types of headaches. That calls for the inner hemispheric training. Insurance won't cover my services. I'm a certified neurofeedback coach. My background's in human development. So I cannot claim to treat any condition, or I cannot diagnose. I have to work within my scope of practice, which is optimizing human development. Over the decade I've been doing this, because there is a lack of licensed health care providers in this field, in this area, I end up working with people with a wide range of challenges. And, most of my clients had severe conditions that they've had for a long time, and they've tried the more mainstream approaches and didn't get the relief they were looking for. So they give neurofeedback a try. And given that that's the group I'm typically working with, more than 80% of them get a real good response. Not 100%. There's at least 10% that don't seem to respond. I think there's a lot of things that can be behind that. It could be a hidden toxin exposure like it was in my case. It could be a nutritional deficiency, some kind of illness, infection. But not everyone responds. But a good 80% get a real good response. Yes, I did. That was essential. I actually did 50 neurofeedback sessions before I figured out the toxic mold illness part, and I got dramatic short-term gains from those sessions, but they didn't hold. And then I figured out ultimately I understood the reason why was I had an ongoing exposure to toxic mold. So I had toxic mold both from the fence posts, and I built my own house, and I tried to make it as energy efficient as possible. And so I built a real tight vapor barrier. I was off the grid, so I had a little tiny ventilation fan, but it wasn't adequate. I didn't run dehumidifiers because I had solar and hydropower, but my hydropower the stream dried up in the summer. So I didn't have enough power in the summer to run dehumidifiers, and because my house was so airtight, it was too humid year-round. And so there was a kind of mold in my house called aspergillus. There had been no water intrusion. Overall, I built my house well, but I hadn't realized how important it was to make sure your house breathes well. So there was aspergillus in my house, which grows from humidity alone. Yes. So I had to take a toxin-binding medication. Right. So I could have been, had I not figured that out, I could have been part of the 10% for whom it doesn't work. But I was fortunate to figure that piece out. Yeah. It often does. And the way it helps with that is that many of us eat for emotional soothing. So if you're eating as a way to soothe yourself, and you come to neurofeedback, and your nervous system moves to a much more comfortable place, that need to soothe through eating is dramatically reduced. So many people experience some weight loss as a result. You know, and plus you have better impulse control as a result of the training. Yeah. Yeah, well, Dr. Daniel Amen agrees with your perspective that hitting a soccer ball with your head can cause mild brain injury, especially if you're doing it repetitively. Even a high dive, you know, high divers who are just hitting the water, you know, and certainly football. The scientific evidence that playing tackle football causes brain damage is just mounted up to, you know, undeniable at this point. You know, and boxing is another real concerning sport. Yeah. And helmets don't protect us as much as we like to think they do. Our brains are soft. They're kind of like, yeah, they're very soft. They're, you know, jello-like. And some of the bones on the inside of the inside of the scalp are sharp. They have sharp ridges, and you know that soft brain hitting those ridges can cause damage. This is Healing Anxiety and Depression by Dr. Daniel Amen. It was a book where I first read about neurofeedback, and it helped me understand that I likely had that toxins might be an aspect of my mental illness. Amen, like a prayer. And he is a best-selling author of, you know, probably 20-some books now. And he has DVDs, PBS DVDs. You know, he's a psychiatrist who uses supplements as a first line of treatment or neurofeedback. So I've had several child clients who went to the Amen clinics, and they were, you know, told, well, you could go on this medication, and it might help you with this frame of time, or you can take these supplements and go to neurofeedback, and you'll probably get the same kind of relief in a more long-lasting way. It might take a slightly longer, and those two clients who came from the Amen clinics both responded beautifully to neurofeedback. This one is Healing Anxiety and Depression. Yeah, but I read this in 2005, and I don't know if he's updated this one, but he's got a lot more recent books than this. The 7 types of anxiety and depression are in this one. He has another one on ADD that divides that into like 7 types. The SPEC scans typically are not covered by insurance. I don't know. My sister took her husband to the Amen clinic. There's now one in New York City. And in her case, she was disappointed. She didn't feel she got much gain from that SPEC scan. You know, and eventually they figured out, they knew he had Parkinson's, but eventually they figured out he had frontotemporal dementia. And you would have thought they could have identified that from the SPEC scan, and they didn't. They identified it finally in Rochester. So, and people. I don't know, because I haven't gone, but I know my sister found it pricey and disappointing in the outcome in their case. Yes, it's a diagnostic. I mean, he has now introduced neurofeedback to all his, like 1 or 2 years ago, he finally brought neurofeedback practitioners into his clinics. I don't know why it took so long, because he was a neurofeedback provider like 20 years ago, so I don't know. He didn't discover it, but NASA was one of the players in the early discovery of neurofeedback. Yeah, and they're also working with it in other areas of the world. But I'll tell you the story of how NASA got involved. It was kind of by accident. There was a researcher at the UCLA back, I don't know, around 1970, who wanted to see if you could train animals to take voluntary control of their brain waves. And he was working with cats, and I think he implanted sensors in their head or whatever, and he was monitoring a particular brain wave called sensory motor rhythm that comes in bursts. And it's the dominant state when the cat is just sitting there, not moving, waiting for a mouse to come by. And so whenever they produce a burst of sensory motor rhythm, they would get milk and gravy as a reward. Well, the cat started producing more and more and more big bursts of sensory motor rhythm. So the researcher proved that, yeah, cats can take voluntary control of their brainwaves. But these are research cats. His research project ended, but the research cats went from one research project to another research project, and so did the researcher. So a couple of years later, he's doing research for NASA. And NASA's trying to figure out how tightly do we need to engineer the capsule the astronauts are going to be in to make sure no rocket fuel gets in. Because rocket fuel exposure can cause seizures and neurological harm. How minute a dose can they be exposed to without harm? So the same researcher was working with cats, exposing them to rocket fuel. And the cats, different groups of cats were coming through, and they were getting seizures and neurological harm. Some of them were dying. They were terribly sick. And then this one group of cats comes through. And they get somewhat sick, but they're not having seizures. They're not dying. They're not getting the most dramatic neurological effects, but they're getting the same dose. Why? What's different? What's different about this group of cats? So he goes back through their research history. And he finds, oh, these are the same cats I worked with a couple years ago, taught them to produce sensory motor rhythm in their brain. Did that somehow make them seizure resistant? Well, he had a research assistant who had epilepsy. She had severe seizures at night, but she was able to work during the day. So he didn't even know if humans had that same brainwave. He hooked her up and figured out, yep, people have that same brainwave. So he created this light box where the more sensory motor rhythm she produced, the more lights would light up. And that was her feedback. She became completely seizure-free. So the civilian world began working with people with seizure disorders and doing neurofeedback with them. But NASA continues to use neurofeedback to increase seizure resistance in the astronauts in case they get any small exposures to rocket fuel, and for peak performance. And because they have to perform under tremendous stress and pressure, so you want them to be able to maintain calm in stressful conditions. So NASA's been doing neurofeedback ever since with astronauts. And the people that began working with seizure disorders, they noticed, well, gee, not only is our seizures improving, but sleep's improving. Dyslexia is improving. Anxiety, depression is improving. And so over time, neurofeedback began to work with wider and wider range of patients. So it was first used on a person in 1972. It grew very slowly the first couple decades because it was dependent upon computer technology, which was very expensive. Few people knew how to operate. But then in the past 15 years, when computers became easier to operate, more and more people learned how to operate them, the field has really grown. It's a very fast evolving field now. But there's lots of different branches and pockets and approaches within neurofeedback. But neurofeedback's been here in Syracuse. Syracuse Neurofeedback was started in 2001. So we're one of the longest running neurofeedback practices in upstate New York. I'm thinking of a child I worked with probably 7 years ago. I connected with the family, but she was a child who had autism, mild autism. She had a genetic form, Fragile X syndrome, which is mild in girls and severe in boys. And she was in pre-K. And it was March of her pre-K year when she started neurofeedback. And in pre-K, she got all the supportive services, speech, OT, one-on-one aid. And so I did neurofeedback with her, from up until, through the time that she entered kindergarten, just 4 or 5 months later. And in kindergarten, she didn't need any supportive services. She didn't need a one-on-one aid. And there were even some subject areas where she was at the top of the class. So she had been very language delayed. She had language, but at a very immature level. She was very quiet, very shy, unable to be normally assertive. And she just blossomed. And it was really interesting because neurofeedback put her development in fast forward. So very quickly after starting neurofeedback, she went into the why stage. She was 4.5 or more. But she began asking all those zillion why questions that most kids get to at age 2. So it was a very fatiguing stage for her mom, and her mom was struggling a little bit to understand, but she zipped right through it. And then she was on, so by the time she entered kindergarten, she had age-appropriate language skills. So how much has her school district saved as a result of her parents spending a couple $1,000s on neurofeedback? In that case, Grandma had 2 kids with Fragile X syndrome, 2 grandkids with Fragile X syndrome, and 1 with ADHD. So Grandma ended up buying equipment, and they home trained. And the reason they went on to home training is because she had a brother who was a couple years older, and Fragile X syndrome is much more severe in males. So he had no language. He was 8, had no language. He could only make one sound, which was an E, and he made that loud. You could hear it throughout the building. He was working with my mentor at the start, and I was glad he was my mentor's client. I was glad I had a quiet, shy little girl. Because at the beginning he really protested the sensors on his head, and you could hear that E screaming throughout the building. But very soon, his mom reported that he seemed comfortable in his own skin for the first time in his life. And he got so he could sit through a normal length neurofeedback session. And he began using that one sound he had in a meaningful way. His sister's first name ended in an E sound, and he began using the E for her name. So then they went on to home training because for him it was going to require hundreds of sessions. The mom really was hoping her speech. And one time in the middle of the night, she heard one of her children call out, "Mom!" And she thought, "It's got to be my daughter. My son doesn't speak." But she went to her daughter's room. She was sound asleep. She went to her son's room. He needed his pull-up changed. Again, he's developmentally delayed 8-year-old. But her son doesn't speak. Could he called out Mom? It was a mystery. She wasn't sure. A few months later, she hears Mom, and she wakes up, and there's her son next to her in the middle of the night. Did I hear him say Mom? I thought I did, but she didn't know. There was nobody beside her at that moment to say yes, he did. So a few months later, he played baseball. In the past, the mom had been out in the field coaching him, but now he was 9. She was letting him be out on the field by himself, and she was sitting in the bleachers. And another mom came up and sat next to her and said, "It's amazing how much progress your son's made." And Mom said, "Which progress are you referring to?" And the other mother said, "Speech, his ability to speak." And wait, he doesn't speak. I think he said Mom a couple times, but I'm not sure. Turned out that home where there was sign language and facilitated communication, and at school where there was sign language and facilitated communication, he wasn't speaking because he knew he had other ways to communicate. But on the baseball field with normal kids, he had to speak to be understood, and he did. Now, that's not my area of expertise. I often refer people to Dr. Daniel Amen's site. He has a lot of supplement recommendations, or sometimes I refer here to Natur-Tyme. Sometimes I may share articles about something like lithium orotate, a supplement that I buy here at Natur-Tyme. Lithium orotate. It's lithium is a nutrient. They use it in huge quantities pharmaceutically for bipolar disorder, but you can take it in very low doses. I had a hair mineral analysis that showed my lithium level was, almost undetectable. So I decided to start taking lithium orotate. I buy it here at Natur-Tyme. And so that can be helpful for people with mood swings. But I don't consider it my area of expertise, so I usually refer to other sources. macular degeneration, or there's supplements that help that. Mhm. There's a psychiatrist who's been filling my practice the past 6 months. There's a psychiatrist that is referring a lot of his patients to me. He comes for neurofeedback himself and found it helpful, and then he began sending his patients. Now, I certainly work with a lot of children of nurse practitioners and doctors. There's a growing acceptance, especially the mental health field is beginning to hear more about neurofeedback, because there are some leading researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, who's a leading researcher on trauma recovery, and he's gotten very interested in neurofeedback. Bessel van der Kolk. I'm a terrible speller. Bessel, B-E-S-S-E-L. Then, yeah, then Van, V-A-N. Der Kolk. I think K-O-L-K, and Der, D-E-R. Yeah, so he came out with a book recently, a couple years ago. The Body Keeps Score. It's on trauma, and the last chapter in the book is on neurofeedback. Another book came out a couple years ago by a psychotherapist in Massachusetts, Neurofeedback for Developmental Trauma. And so those books have really helped the mental health field learn about neurofeedback.
I just think it's so great because when you go to someone and you try and like, and you don't get resolution, you don't believe it. I mean, like you just see people in the world, like we're in your city, and you see people, and my heart just goes out to like, they people on the street. These are people who mental health didn't help them, and they're just venting. Like the thing is, we just have so little understanding of it because we've been through like the system. We've seen people go through the system, and the prescription medication like have side effects, and people want to do it. But it's like one area where at least now there's clarity in insurance. There hasn't always been clarity in insurance. So it's like, I mean, we've come such a long way. It's like so amazing. People know so much about the brain. People would say, thankfully, I didn't experience like voices or talk to people that see things that you experience. But I mean, we did talk to information. I think you're very mellow in that part. And I think that you got to give yourself like some respect. If you actually, you decided, I'm going to do something about this. I'm not going to just,
Right. Right. And during the period of time where the deep state neurofeedback sessions were bringing up the repressed memories, I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. So there is a potential book that I could put together. But I'm so busy in my practice that I don't know when I'll get to that.
But I just think it has to come from you, It's
yep.
so easy for people to say, well, they're crazy.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Sorry. Don't do that. Just this way, kind of thing. And the thing is, like, you never have to deal with someone who wants to prove these issues, and I'm not getting, getting 5 minutes with a psychiatrist. And these people took it out one side. What happens, is, the psychiatrist tried it and it worked for them, so now they're willing to do it. But the thing is, I mean, it's just amazing. It's just amazing that this is still available. I just, I mean, it's amazing, because there's so many things with drugs that, that turn people off.
And my brochure is a little outdated because it still has my mentor and his wife on it, and I need to print out a new one. But right now it is just me. Michigan. I'm in Syracuse, and I practice out of my home in Truxton. So yeah, I'm right on Intrepid Lane, near the Brighton Towers. I'm in the Brighton Hill Chiropractic office. I rent space in their office. You're welcome. And if you're curious and you want to try it, I don't mind people coming for a free consult just because they're curious, because I figure it's the way I educate the public, offering those free sessions. And maybe you don't need it, but maybe sometime you'll learn about it and then you'll share it with somebody else. And so you can come for a free session just because you're curious. That'd be fun. Right. Right, and Natur-Tyme played a key role. Right, and it was here at Natur-Tyme that I connected with my mentor. Yep. So it's great to come full circle and be up here giving a presentation.